James Arthur Baldwin was born on August 2nd, 1924. When Baldwin was an infant, his mother, Emma Burtis, moved to Harlem, New York, where she married David Baldwin. James later discovered that his stepfather was actually his biological father. James' mother worked as a domestic, and his father was a laborer and a preacher. The family was poor, and James spent much of his childhood caring for his 8 brothers and sisters. Soft-spoken and slight of stature, James thought of himself for many years as ugly and wrote of his struggle to accept the way he looked. His father treated James harshly and seemed to resent him. This became the inspiration for many of Baldwin's literary works. Through the trials of his childhood, Baldwin learned the importance of family and the need for love. This theme appears in Sonnys Blues, as well as most of Baldwin's other works. At the age of 14, his family's problems, as well as his father's abuse, led James to join the Pentecostal church, where he too became a preacher. James drew larger crowds than his father did. Later, James admitted that he had used his time as a preacher to get him through his own personal crises. Yet his experience with the church influenced his writings. During his years of high school, James wrote for the school magazine, worked odd jobs, and as a means to escape his family problems, he wrote short stories, essays, and book reviews. These writings were later collected and published in a volume entitled Notes of a Native Son. It was also during his teenage years that James began to recognize his own homosexuality. Baldwin's novels, essays, and stories reveal his intolerance of bigotry of any kind. Due to the American prejudice of blacks and homosexuals in the 1940s, Baldwin quit preaching and moved to France in order to distance himself from the prejudice. In his own words, he wanted to see himself and his writings beyond the context of Black America. He wanted to be read not as merely a Negro, or even merely a Negro writer. James also lived in Switzerland and Turkey and would come to be seen as an influential exile writer because of the experiences outside of the United States which impacted his life and his writings. Baldwin included much of his life experience in his writings. For instance, Go Tell It on the Mountain, Baldwin's first novel, was published as fiction, but took on the feel of an autobiography of James himself. The book tells of a poor boy growing up in Harlem in the 1930s under the tyranny of his father, an autocratic preacher who hated his son. Giovanni's Room fictionally depicted his life as a homosexual, although it was written exclusively about white characters. His next 2 novels, Another Country and Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone, deal with the turbulence of the 1960s, racism, and social issues concerning homosexuality. Baldwin lived in an age when blacks in the South were under continual threat of racial violence and in which civil rights workers faced brutal beatings and even death. These novels portray the feelings of unrest and outrage that James was experiencing in his own life. In the 1960s, James was active in the civil rights movement, as well as social strains such as the relationships between Christians and the Black Muslim movement. Baldwin stood his ground in his writings and stood true to his convictions, no matter what the public was saying about him. He continued to write from his own emotions, experiences, and beliefs. After his return to the United States, Baldwin became greatly involved in racial equality issues and conducted lectures for students, white liberals, and anyone who wanted to learn more about the historical civil rights movement led by Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Baldwin was instrumental in voicing the concerns of civil rights, not only a political issue, but a moral issue. He took part in the Civil Rights March on Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963, with such supporters as Harry Belafonte, Lorraine Hansberry, Charlton Heston, Sidney Poitier, and Marlon Brando. Yet Baldwin did not want to be known as a civil rights activist, but as a citizen. Baldwin's literary career also influenced the works of Maya Angelou, who referred to James as her friend and brother, and credited him for inspiring her to write her 1969 autobiography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Baldwin's final writings focused on the importance of black families. He concluded his career by publishing a volume of poetry entitled Jimmy's Blues. Not only was James Baldwin a talented writer, but he was able to provoke thought and arouse emotion in his readers. James Baldwin died of stomach cancer on December 1st, 1987 in southern France at the age of 63. Following his death, a fellow journalist from Baltimore named Kevin Brown founded the National James Baldwin Literary Society. This group organizes free public events celebrating James Baldwin's life and legacy. In 1992, Hampshire College in Massachusetts established the James Baldwin Scholarships Program, an urban outreach program that provides talented students of color from underserved communities an opportunity to become successful in the college environment. One of Baldwin's most popular short stories, Sonnys Blues, is used in introductory college literary classes at Hampshire and many other colleges and universities across the country. James Baldwin has been listed as one of the 100 greatest African Americans of all time. His focus on controversial societal issues such as family relationships, racism, religion, homosexuality, personal identity, and the civil rights movement has contributed to the growth and understanding of these issues in today's society.
Sonnys Blues is a short story written in the first-person narrative style. As the story begins, the narrator is reading a story in the newspaper about his younger brother, Sonny, who has been arrested for using and dealing heroin. The narrator teaches algebra at the high school in Harlem. He is a stable family man. He is 7 years older than his brother, Sonny. He has been given the responsibility by their mother at her death to parent and protect Sonny. He goes through his day filled with guilt and grief. Walking home at the end of the day, he is approached by a childhood friend, an addict who blames himself for Sonny's addiction and arrest. They discussed what has happened to Sonny and what will happen to him now that he has been arrested. The narrator begins, filled with anger, to try to understand how and why Sonny has come to this, an addict and a prisoner. The entire time that Sonny is in prison or in rehab, the narrator neglects to contact him until after the narrator's daughter, Gracie, dies of polio. Even though it has been a long while since hearing from his brother, Sonny replies immediately, asking forgiveness and trying to explain. He tries to explain how and why he got hooked on heroin. Sonny expresses uncertainty over what will happen to him when he is released. When Sonny is released from prison, his brother takes him on a drive around the city. This brought up many memories of their life as they were growing up. The narrator begins to relive the times in their young adult lives that must have greatly influenced him and Sonny both. In one scene, their mother asks the narrator to take care of Sonny and to watch out for him when she dies. She tells him that his own father had a brother who was very much like Sonny, but who was killed by drunken whites on a rural road in the South. In a second flashback, the narrator tells us that following his mother's funeral, the narrator arranges for the teenage Sonny to live with his fiancée Isabel's family while he is at war. In a third flashback, Sonny clashes with Isabel's middle-class family, who don't understand his passion for music. his desire to hang out downtown with other musicians, both white and black, or his rejection of Isabel's family's values and lifestyle. He runs away and joins the Navy, goes to Greece, and returns to live in New York's Greenwich Village, where he presumably struggles as a musician and a heroin addict, maintaining a fragile and intermittent relationship with his brother until he is picked up the final time on drug charges. Following these flashback scenes, we see the brothers trying to repair their relationship, threatened still by Sonnys addiction, which is under control but hovering in the wings, and by the narrator slowly coming closer to understanding Sonny. Sonny invites him to a nightclub in Greenwich Village where he is able to witness Sonny in his element, playing the music that helps him remain whole and stay sane. Here at the end of the story, the narrator finally begins to understand Sonny's struggle and how music helps him and his audience endure and perhaps triumph over it. On our slide here, we look at the different plot analysis. Our initial situation and exposition is where Sonny is arrested, and our narrator, Sonny's brother, learns of it. And the biggest conflict in Sonny's and the narrators, or in our story, is of Sonny and his brother trying to get along, mostly because neither of the other understands the way that they live their lives and try to survive. Some rising actions or complications in it is that the two brothers can't get along, so they don't talk. They just stay separate from one another. And then the narrator's daughter dies of polio, so then they start corresponding again. An epiphany for both of our characters was the revival meeting where the brothers both attended. Sonny was on the street watching it at close range, and our narrator was in his apartment watching our black revivalists sing a song. I think that the climax in our story was the following argument in their apartment when Sonny was trying very hard to tell his brother all that he was going through and why he was going through it, and his brother just was refusing to even hear, and therefore causing a lot of conflict among them, between the two of them. The denouement or following action in it was finally when Sonny is playing at the bar, his brother, the narrator, discovers the passion that he has for it and how it helps him, Sonny, stay sane and help him get through. So kind of as a peace offering then, the resolution in the story would be that the narrator brings Sonny a scotch and a milk and sets it on his piano. Our characters in the story, Sonny is the main character's brother. Our main character is the narrator. Sonny is seen through his brother's eyes. He's quiet and withdrawn. He's characterized in the story as wild but not crazy. So he likes to have a good time, but he doesn't do things real impulsively. He's addicted to heroin and constantly struggles with his own emotions. He's headed to jail and has a huge passion for music. In fact, when he's staying with the narrator's in-laws, he kind of drives them crazy with his music. Our narrator is the main character, and he's never given a name in the story, so I think he feels kind of anonymous and kind of behind the scenes. He and Sonny both grew up in Harlem, and he teaches algebra, so he got a college education, but he never got out of Harlem. He keeps his feelings inside, and he manages to ignore his pain. Isabel is Sonny's sister-in-law. She's our narrator's wife, and she's open and talkative and friendly, and she does a good job of keeping the relationship between Sonny and our narrator open. Creole is another prominent character in our story. He leads the band that Sonny has played in the past, and he kind of serves as a father figure for Sonny, one that the narrator, Sonny's brother, doesn't really realize until he meets him in the bar. Also, other characters are Sonny's mother, his father, the uncle that was killed on the road one night coming home, and Sonny's friend. One of the themes for our story is suffering, and this is a quote from the story. Sonny feels like that there's no way out of suffering, and our narrator feels as though everyone has to suffer, but you just take it and walk away. Another theme in our story is the artistic expression. Sonny needs music to survive, and the narrator just doesn't really get that. He says, the dry, low black man said something awful on the drums. Creole answered, and the drums talked back. The horn insisted, sweet and high, slightly detached perhaps, and Creole listened. So by putting human characteristics on the music, it kind of characterized how Sonny really felt about it. Another theme in our story is racism. Their race kept them in Harlem, and his uncle was killed because of racism. And he felt trapped as a young teenager. He wanted out of Harlem, and his brother just didn't see a way to do it. And the narrator saw that in his students as he was teaching.
Next, we'll be discussing the context and relevancy of Sonny's Blues. It took place in approximately the 1950s in Harlem, New York. This was prior to the Civil Rights Movement, which majority of the action takes place during this time. The Civil Rights Movement was 1954 to 64. This is noted in segregated classrooms, which became illegal in 1954 following Brown v. Board. Here's a line from the narrator. These boys now were living as we've been living then. They were growing up with a rush, and their heads bumped abruptly against the low ceiling of their actual possibilities. This kind of just emphasizes the impact that discrimination and segregation had on young black men at that time period. They were inhibited by segregation, discrimination, exposure to crime, and drugs. Also noted was there was a point before the Civil Rights Movement due to the narrator's uncle being brutally killed by a group of drunk white men and no restitution being given. A line from the narrator's mother that talks about his uncle being killed. Your father says he heard his brother scream when the car rolled over him, and he heard the wood of that guitar when it hit, and he heard them strings go flying, and he heard them white men shouting, and the car kept on going, and it ain't stopped till this day. Next, another big part of the story was the Harlem housing projects. There was a large influx of people that began in the 1950s. Due to the deteriorating condition of many of the homes and the dense population, they began to be replaced by multi-tiered public housing projects. This resulted in the forced relocation of blacks when their homes were torn down. These housing projects destroyed many homes, places of business, meeting areas, parks, etc. Vibrant neighborhoods and communities were destroyed. Few of the housing projects were in good repair due to such overcrowding. Another line from the narrator that emphasizes this. We live in a housing project. It hasn't been up long. A few days after it was up, it seemed uninhabitably new. Now, of course, it's already run down. The tenants of these projects were predominantly poor and black. There was a large amount of crime and drug use. Heroin was the drug of choice in the 1950s and 60s. which also increased the crime and abuse, and this is noted in the narrator's brother Sonny, who has a heroin problem and was picked up for that. Lastly, the narrator, he chose to live in the housing projects, even though he was likely middle class due to his position as a teacher. He still chose to live in the projects, and this is likely due to segregation. The military service also plays a big part in the story. Both the narrator and Sonny belonged in the military. African Americans have a long-standing history with volunteering for military service. It allowed them an escape from poverty, drugs, and crime. Here's a line from Sonny. I couldn't tell you when Mama died, but the reason I wanted to leave Harlem so bad was to get away from drugs. And I think that was the truth for many. Lastly, jazz music was a big part of this story. Jazz music of the 1950s incorporated social injustices and inequalities for people of color or those who were poor. Hard bop was one of the signature styles of the 1950s, predominantly found on the East Coast, which was where Sonny was, and it combined jazz with blues. Beat Generation was born out of Greenwich Village in New York, and that turned jazz into a way to protest what was going on in society. There was a point in the story, too, that Sonny was found to be in Greenwich Village instead of going to school, and he was there with other musicians. Lastly, there's a line from the narrator that emphasizes the importance of jazz music at this time. For while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted, and how we may triumph is never new, it always must be heard. There isn't any other tales to tell. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness. So that really emphasizes the importance of jazz music to them at that time and allowed them a way to speak about the injustices that they were facing. Relevance to life today, obviously many gains have been made from the Civil Rights Act, but it's important to not forget the injustices that have occurred and continue to occur in this country. It is important that we study this piece of literature, not only to appreciate the gains that have been made as a society, but also to realize the importance of family, communication, and artistic expression.